Welcome to Biota Live. I'm Tom Barbalet, and this is a continuation of the Biota podcasts. For more information on the Biota podcasts, check out biota.org/podcast. We have two callers on the line. Hello, first caller.
This is Larry Yaeger. Hi.
Hi, Larry. Good to talk to you. We have a second caller on the line who I believe is Bruce Damer.
That's right.
Hello, Bruce.
Hello, Larry.
So we have only very brief news and notes before we get into this evening's continuing show topic with Larry. The next episode, January 23rd, 8 p.m. Pacific, Zan Gill, like Larry, will return. And I've asked Zan to talk about artificial life and the environmental movement. This was something that she touched on briefly in her last appearance on Biota Live, and also something which she talked about to slightly greater length at the Greater meeting in San Francisco. But I wanted her to talk a little bit more about her ideas with regards to how artificial life and the environmental movement are inextricably interconnected, and I'm sure she will provide a number of insights, and probably even more than when she talked to Grayson. Bruce, you were at that Grayson meeting, weren't you?
Yes, indeed.
So I think it'll be interesting to hear what Zan has to say, particularly with regards to her changing thinking and interlinking with her other aspects, which she talked about when she was last on Biota Live. And February the 6th, this is one for Bruce to attend as well, Mark Badeau will be on. This is his first appearance on Biota Live, but I think we had him on probably about 2 years ago now with regards to a Biota interview. And a number of topics, again, to discuss with Mark. I think, obviously, his recent book that Bruce is now a scholar of. What was his, is it Proto-Life? Is that his most recent book?
It's Proto-Cells Bridging Non-Living and Living Matter.
Right. Proto-Life is his company, so he'll have an opportunity to give us all an update with regards to wet artificial life, what he's doing with Proto-Life specifically, and possibly also discuss one of the topics that we're going to be discussing with Larry this evening with regards to the curriculum of artificial life as it's being taught in various universities, because I think certainly the Artificial Life Journal can lead the field, or at least the discussion with regards to that topic. So it'll be wonderful to have Mark on Biota Live. So if folks want to call in on that one, it's February the 6th, 8 p.m. Pacific. We'll have Mark Badeau. So at the end of last year, I asked for feedback. This is obviously the second year of Biota Live, and we got a lot of feedback in, a lot of interesting, a lot of positive feedback. And one piece of feedback that amused me slightly was the idea of algorithms and blues. And algorithms, obviously, we're going to discuss a little bit more with Larry this evening, but the idea that some of what we do in Biota Live is fundamentally about the poor and oppressed artificial life developer, and that certainly made me chuckle a little, and I passed it on to others in the community as well. I think what we're trying to do with Biota Live currently is talk about the current state of the art, the current developers, what their experiences are, and motivations towards the future. And whilst some of that may seem a little bleak, I know we talked about the artificial life winter towards the end of last year, and no doubt these kind of topics will be coming through, particularly quality of life issues, these kind of things. I think it's important to have this discussion in order to move the whole thing forward in a productive direction. So we'll try to tone down some of the blues elements with regards to this year's Biota Live, but it may come up through general discussion. So, Bruce, I received 3 videos from you and your comrades this week with regards to I Am Darwin. Would you like to talk a little bit more about your I Am Darwin videos?
Yeah, you've got one from myself, Alan Lundell, who, of course, is my friend and neighbor and co-founder of the Digibarn Museum, and Nick Herbert, who's a well-known physicist and author. And we decided to do three of these at once, and I think they'll really fit what you're trying to do.
Certainly, and I predicted both Al and Nick's videos would be controversial, and certainly by the star ratings, I think folks have felt Nick's instigation. I mean, I think people should check out i-am-darwin.org to get the 3 videos. We also got a submission last night from a young film producer in New York, which I thought was very nice, and also Biota's own Jeffrey Ventrella. We've eased the requirements, particularly from Bruce's 3 submissions, so you can see some of the other formats that people are starting to submit in for the I Am Darwin videos. And Larry, does this sound like something that you'd want to do?
Indeed, I was actually glancing at a few of those just before calling in and thinking, oh gosh, I ought to get around to doing this.
Terrific. Yeah, it'd be wonderful to have you on the site, and certainly some of your cohorts at Indiana, I think, could probably also create some quite impressive I Am Darwin videos, particularly now people are inserting their own graphics and inspiration. I think there's a lot of visualization potential through the videos coming up.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I was thinking it might be nice to throw a little bit of Polyworld visualization, interweave it somehow. I have no idea what will come out, but we'll see.
That's the nature of the experiment, I think. So, Bruce, are you going to be in London for Darwin's birthday?
Yes, there's a big event being organized by Rachel Armstrong at, I'm not sure of the location. It's part of the Bartlett School, University of London, and she was talking about some major location in London. But it's an event right on the evening of the February 12th of Darwin's 200th birthday.
Yes, I'm not sure. I don't think we'll be recording a Biota Live in that week, our Biota 6th, and then we have one following that. But certainly, as I was thinking about the dream list of folks that I'd like to have on this year's Biota Live, obviously Chris Langton and Richard Dawkins are long-time attempts at getting both of them on. Do you get a sense that you'll be communicating with Dawkins this year, Bruce?
I think I will. I think that the Evil Grid project will get sufficiently developed that perhaps in the fall I'll take a trip up to Oxford and hope to have tea with him again, if that's possible these days.
Well, I was looking at his Wikipedia entry and also the Wikipedia entry with regards to the Blind Watchmaker, and both of them had been expunged in terms of his, founding father, or at least founding participant status associated with artificial life. So maybe this is a shout-out to the Biota community that if folks want to look at those two Wikipedia entries and make noticeable corrections, either that or maybe maybe his legacy is moving away from artificial life. Larry, you've talked about meeting Richard Dawkins in the past. What's your sense with regards to his impact on the artificial life community?
Well, it was huge on me. At that very first Artificial Life conference that Chris Langton organized back at Los Alamos, Richard was one of the speakers, and he was very inspiring and lots of interesting ideas about, as people were talking about, life existing at the edge of chaos. I think it was Richard who said something about, in fact, a key aspect of living systems that they may be constantly evolving to have greater evolvability, and that was kind of pictured as spiraling up this edge of chaos. It was a lovely image and very inspiring. I've also spoken with him specifically about Polyworld because when I was doing that for Alan Kay and the Vivarium program, and Richard Dawkins was an advisor to the program. So we got a chance to sit and talk about it at very, very early days, and there's still a miscegenation function in there that was kind of at his behest. So I know that he has expressed an interest. As a matter of fact, he wanted to use video from Polyworld at his Royal Society Christmas lectures, and I prepared a tape for him and sent it off, and they had a failure of the VCR that would translate NTSC into their video format, and so into PAL format, and so it ended up not being able to be used. I was very depressed over that, but so I know he's had an interest in it in its early days. Could you explain what you mean by his artificial life things being expunged from Wikipedia? A little background on what was there and what isn't there anymore?
Well, I track this kind of passively, but certainly, I mean, when you think about the Blind Watchmaker, that is, pretty well a turning point in a number of artificial life developers' thinking, and also quite explicitly in artificial life-related text. It struck me as quite strange that I recall reading previously artificial life references in the Blind Watchmaker article in Wikipedia, but certainly with regards to Dawkins' own entry, there used to be a number of links backwards and forwards into the artificial life section of the Wikipedia entry, and actually had explicit tags for Richard Dawkins from artificial life back into his own entry. So I don't know. This thing evolves in very curious ways. We have obviously had Jay Lemon on the podcast quite a while back, and I've had some correspondence with Jay associated with Jeffrey Ventrella's entry. It's a very curious thing, Wikipedia. I think the current state associated with artificial life in particular has a number of gaping holes and certainly doesn't give a coherent history over the period of time that certainly you started developing Polyworld and I started developing Noble Ape. I mean, the 90s are pretty well eliminated, and I think even the later projects don't feature as heavily as they could. But ultimately, I think in some part the responsibility goes back to the community. I mean, my correspondence with Jeffrey and John P. Yaeger and Jay Lemon associated with Jeffrey's own work related to who was making these edits and how these edits were being made. And certainly, whilst there is history associated with pseudonyms and IP addresses, and it's impossible to track a coherent sense of what is actually going on with regards to all these entries. But I think it's,
You should try Wikiscanner. A student of mine, Virgil Griffith, who's off now at, who gave that Google talk on Polyworld and is now at Caltech Computational Neuroscience Group, also did Wikiscanner. I think that's the name of it. That thing that lets you look at articles in there and find people who've edited it, look for, and it does back traces on IP addresses and finds out who's editing what.
So there are two problems with that. Firstly, Wikiscanner typically works towards corporate IP addresses, but when you have a hobbyist community that have varying internet addresses, and particularly with regards to, I mean, if it's coming from Dawkins' own community, if it's coming from people against Dawkins, I mean, it's impossible to track this kind of stuff. The second problem is with regards to the deletion of entries. And I can't remember whether Polyworld has maintained a coherent Wikipedia link. It has been maintained certainly over the period of time that I've tracked it most recently. But a problem that Jeffrey was having was that every project that he'd worked on, including there.com and a wide variety of other non-artificial life-specific entries, had a history of being deleted and reinstated and deleted again and then reinstated. And I don't know how effective Wikiscanner would be with regards to the reinstatement, but this is a kind of, behind-the-scenes politicking associated with just maintaining a coherent history associated with artificial life. So there are half a dozen of us that do track these things, but I found it particularly strange looking at, the current entry for Dawkins and also the Blind's Watchmaker that there was no discussion associated with artificial life in either of those entries.
Huh.
But just also talking about, founding folk that I would like to get back in the conversation. You mentioned last time you were on, Larry, that you use Chris Langton's papers as kind of bookends to either side of your course.
That's right.
Do you have current communication with Chris Langton? Do you get a sense of his willingness to, interact with something like Biota Live?
Well, actually, I'm pretty sure Chris would not be interested in doing it. He's just gone a different direction with his life, and there were some issues that I really don't want to get into between him and SFI.
Yeah, no, I think most of the community are privy to at least the precursory nature of that. My concern is that what we're trying to do with Biota is actually, and I've done this quite explicitly with Steve Grand over a number of months, reinforce the fact that this is a new, contemporary, not necessarily historically polluted project. What we're trying to do here is motivate, the likes of Virgil Griffith, the next generation of the folk that you saw as undergraduates and graduates at A-Life 10 of 11 to become part of the discussion, and we need to have a coherent view of the history. I had correspondence today with Carl Sims, actually, in that light. And I think the need is, in some regard, and I do appreciate the nature of these kind of deep-rooted, particularly, Chris Life's work associated with artificial life, the kind of emotion and things attached to it. But nonetheless, if there's going to be a coherent history written, and this is the point that I've made back to Dawkins and his people as well, it would be wonderful to have these people actively, even if they just participate as Steve Grand did with regards to 3 relatively potted interviews that were very much under Steve's control. I mean, I could certainly offer those to Chris and Professor Dawkins without any problem. But I think the need currently is that we have a coherent history that includes the historical legacy, includes what went on in the 90s, which isn't actively represented in Wikipedia, and empowers...
I just looked at Wikipedia while we were talking about it here, and indeed, the only mention of Chris Langton's name on the entire page is a reference down at the very bottom.
Exactly.
And, so, I mean, yeah, there's a real dearth of information about the origins of the field. That's not really, that's not appropriate. I think you're right. That could really use some editing there.
But it would also, I mean, I think it also requires people like Chris Langton and Richard Dawkins, if they don't, if they're not regular callers into Biota Live, to at least participate in the kind of oral history component of what I'm trying to do with these podcasts. And certainly I've made this point quite strongly back to Professor Dawkins and his folk, and I think Bruce will go on bended knee in order to try and, reconnect in some real sense with regards to Professor Dawkins. But when I was looking at, this will be my 4th year of recording these podcasts come March, and when I'm looking at people that I'd like to participate, even if it is, in a secondary way, even if it is someone such as yourself talking with Chris, Larry, or, these kind of passive interactions, it would be wonderful to have some kind of oral history sense associated with these people.
Well, for what it's worth, I tried, I traded some email with Chris to see about getting him to participate in any fashion that he would choose, including my preference being a keynote speaker at A-Life 10, because I was a co-organizer for it. I could do that, just ask him, and he said thanks, but no thanks. And I'm afraid you're going to get the same response.
I think you'll need to send Virgil after him. I think the next generation has a tenacity that perhaps we lack in some regard.
And as you say, no links with the bad parts of the past, no bad memories attached. So who knows, maybe.
Well, Larry, I think you probably, out of the people that appeared on Biota Live last year, generated a sizable amount of correspondence. We have had on some quite controversial guests, and thankfully you weren't too controversial, but you did leave a number of questions with the community, and I think the 2 interesting components that came through were the idea of the low-level algorithms that we started discussing, and this was the feedback from the correspondent who emailed me about algorithms and blues, that we should talk more about algorithms, what algorithms artificial life developers needed to know, kind of groundwork. But this also leads into the idea of teaching artificial life, which I wanted to talk to you about in a kind of fuller format this evening. So if we start with the idea of algorithms, I mean, I do appreciate when you teach your course, particularly in terms of giving papers, the algorithms are there and the context is there. But if you were talking to someone such as Virgil when you first met him, or these kind of people, what kind of algorithms would you encourage them to read about or learn or start implementing in their own work?
Well, to a certain extent, it depends entirely on, what approach they want to take to artificial life. It's a pretty large area. Almost certainly they should know something about genetic algorithms, because evolution is key to almost any of the A-Life systems. Although, I mean, there are people who study, rabbit fox or rabbit and lettuce patch, Lotka Volterra predator-prey interactions, and you watch and study how, populations of agents interact without evolving anything. So even that's not a given that it's a necessity, but all the stuff I'm interested in involves evolution, and so genetic algorithms is an obvious place to start. I happen to particularly care about models of nervous systems, so artificial neural networks is a key area, but not everybody has to do that. Some people are doing things that are a lot more morphologically, dynamically motivated, and so spring networks and mass spring combinations can be, incredibly rich in what they're capable of, the animations they're capable of producing. So, but for me, neural networks is key. I suppose I'm cheating a little bit here and looking at some of your suggested notes in this area, which reminds me that some people very much feel a need to look at physics and incorporate some sort of physics engine. I chose to try my best to finesse that in my work, just because I knew it would take an enormous amount of computational time, and wanted to extract the most I could out of my artificial neural networks and evolution.
So looking at those two things initially and digging a little bit deeper than my kind of dot point notes, neural networks as a concept, in terms of the folks coming into artificial life who may be listening to this podcast, I think, when I used to develop Noble Ape prior to it becoming a, fully fledged flag-waving open source application, I would get emails from kids as young as, 13, 15. I think the youngest kid who emailed me was a 12-year-old, but it was that kind of age group. And they were really looking for software that they could tinker with. And I appreciate it as well because this is fundamentally about the time that I started writing Yaeger simulations myself. And my knowledge of mathematics back then was very, very applied. I didn't really understand calculus. I didn't understand, all these kind of computational fluid dynamics that I think, the folks such as yourself and myself kind of take for granted through our various studies in university and what have you. But in terms of this kind of age group, where would you start in terms of writing a kind of genetic algorithm experiment?
Well, genetic algorithms are actually, people spend their entire careers studying how to make them work more efficiently under certain conditions and how to make them work more robustly under certain conditions. But in principle, they're sort of delightfully simple. You have this bit string, and you make the ones and the zeros of the bit string correspond to something you want your model to do. And you go around flipping bits occasionally with random mutations, but that's pretty usually the small part of the changes, and the greater progression in evolution comes from the mixing and matching of so-called crossover, where you take a bit of DNA from one parent and then switch over and use the next bit of DNA from the other parent and then go back to the first and so on. And you just mix and match bit strings and produce the next generation and turn them loose. In principle, it's sort of delightfully simple. So then it becomes a matter of, maybe figuring out exactly what you want to apply it to. Genetic algorithms have been applied to so many things, from the shapes of airfoils to deriving the Mona Lisa, as we saw just recently.
In an artificial life context, however, I think probably the most simple two examples are cellular automata with genetic algorithms as central components, either with regards to the consumption of energy or various movement principles or breeding principles or all these kind of things. And I think what you're saying with regards to simplicity rings true with my own experience and experiments as well, that you start putting genetic properties on a wide variety of factors, and then the genetic algorithms do all of the work for you. So in that regard, I guess genetic algorithms are probably simpler for someone to initially implement than something like a neural network. Can you imagine someone without a university-level education implementing a neural network? And if so, how do you think they should start?
I can, actually. Neural networks also, here again, there are a huge number of different models of ways you can approach it, from incredibly complex Hodgkin-Huxley model with tens of parameters, each of them biophysically motivated, and you're solving differential equations, and it's really complex. To something like I'm using in Polyworld is actually remarkably simple, so-called summing and squashing neural networks. Basically, you just say, okay, you got a bunch of artificial neurons. They have some activation, maybe between 0 and 1, and then you look at the connections between neurons, and you have some way of specifying what's connected to what. And then to calculate sort of the next state of one of these neurons, you just sum up the things that connect to it times the weight of the connection between those neurons, maybe shove it through a sigmoid, which is just this 1 over 1 plus e to the minus x. It's just a simple way of compressing it back down into that range of 0 to 1. Boom, you're done. That's it. That's the extent of it. No differential equations, no integration. You're just calculating. And that's a discrete time neural network, which you can have recurrent connections or not. Recurrent just means that, you can have a loop in the way things connect. Things connect back on each other. Or then you take a tiny step up and you have continuous time recurrent neural networks, where you have, instead of just having the next state calculated like I described, that all that calculation does is produce a delta, a slight change in the activation of the downstream neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. And from there, you can start talking about spiking models. But, one of the best spiking models in the world, to my knowledge, is Eugene Izhikevich's model. Has only 4 parameters, 2 equations, and is remarkably simple to solve. On purpose, he designed it to be computationally efficient and yet still produce an incredibly rich repertoire of neural behaviors. So, yeah, it does take. It's easier, I suppose, if you're comfortable writing down the mathematical equations. But about the most complicated thing you have to write down for some of these models is a summation. That's the hardest bit, and conceptually, summations are awfully simple. So yeah, I can imagine tinkerers and just somebody who's interested in it but not studying it, not doing it for a living, making some progress in this direction.
And I think tinkering's the critical component. Certainly from all the artificial life developers I've talked with, yourself included, it is a time tinkering. If it's taken as a hobby or an academic interest or what have you, the time component is critical with regards to artificial life development. You're, the time tuning component in order to get any of these simulations up and running. And really, if there's something behind all of these different ideas, it's the ability to write code, observe what's going on, and then tune the code in some way, or let the code tune itself in the case of genetic algorithms. So let's talk a little bit more about physics, and this is interesting with the idea of kind of artificial life in simulated environments. I know Polyworld has a simple simulated environment. Certainly a number of the folks we've had on have simulated environments. I encourage Gerald de Jong when he comes on to put his stuff in a simulated environment. Bruce, as you listen in, obviously the genetic algorithm component probably is slightly more connected with what you're thinking about in terms of the Evo grid. But if you have a kind of toolkit that you're going to be using for the Evo grid deep, surely it will contain all of these components in some regard.
Oh, it's interesting. Larry was talking because I was trying to think of how neural networks or artificial life GAs and whatnot fit into the Evo grid. And one of the things that the Evo grid is about is it's about that the algorithms have to sort of self-assemble as well as the objects. So my whole focus is not to write a GA or anything like that. It's actually to build a physics and throw enough computing at it that you get an origin event. So origins of vesicles and origins of, it's all sort of described pretty well in the funny, whimsical movie that we made that we launched, I guess a couple of weeks ago was launched. But it has to emerge. So that's the challenge of the evolution grid, as what Dick Gordon calls the artificial origin of life, or the origin of artificial life. So you can't actually build algorithm and structure. You can only build physics.
But in some regard, I think this is the ultimate, and this isn't the religious intelligent design, but this is certainly the intelligent design discussion that we've had in Biota Lives previous. You need to have some appreciation of what mechanisms need to come through these algorithms in order to brew the soup, to use a metaphor. So, I think irrespective of whether you write these things explicitly, and this is one of the beauties of the kind of interaction between neural networks and genetic algorithms that Larry has with Polyworld, that also we've talked about with Steve Graham, that on some level the mathematics does break down into primitives which are intercompatible. But you raise an interesting point with this idea of physics in terms of the nature of simulated environments, and certainly talking to Larry and talking to Gerald with regards to the physics that he's implemented in Darwin at Home, and also Jeffrey Ventrella with regards to gene pool. The question of physics doesn't necessarily have to map onto real-world physics. It doesn't have to map onto gravity, Newtonian physics, even quantum mechanics. Physics, as we talk about it in an artificial life context, just, I guess, describes some mathematical constraints of the system. Is this your understanding, Larry?
Yeah, in fact, I've been thinking about an entirely different system that was based more sort of on artificial chemistry, I suppose one step up from an artificial physics. And I can certainly imagine wanting to build a system that starts at that level. And it makes a lot of sense to me. I like what Bruce says about, not having to build any algorithms in any higher level algorithms in. But on the other hand, we're all, we're working at different levels, and I think for now at least that's a good thing. A lot of these different approaches should be explored. Chris Langton put it nicely. I said, we all have to write an IOU at some level, and it's just a matter of deciding what level you want to write that IOU at. And as you said, it's important to sort of understand a little bit of the physics or the real-world dynamics of the system you're trying to model. When Danny Hillis, working on the connection machine, was trying to model fluid dynamics, model fluid flows by modeling individual little point particles, they actually managed to get really good, indistinguishable from reality, quote unquote, fluid dynamics out of point masses, bouncing off each other with billiard ball physics, moving at unit velocity on a hexagonal grid. But each of the design decisions that they put into their very, very simple model was kind of understood by people who knew fluid dynamics and knew physics, and were thinking about this in terms of, molecular interactions, only with the ultimate simplified versions of molecules. And as long as you kind of write your IOU at the right level for what you want to study, and you design the system at that level to the best of your ability, taking into account what you know, you can oftentimes get these emergent levels that you don't program in, and have great success at that. When I look back at early A-Life algorithms, Tom Ray wanted to go in search of sort of evolutionary phenomena that he knew about from his biological work and his ecological work, and modeled things at a certain level with his evolving code, and was able to easily produce all the things that he was searching for. And at each stage, we pick our levels, we write our IOUs, and if we've done a decent job of understanding the lower level system, people are actually surprisingly successful at evolving that next level up.
Certainly inspirational words for Bruce in particular. The next thing that occurred to me, and particularly through my recent writing in Nature Inspired Informatics, was the kind of level that we traditionally associate artificial life development with, particularly the ideas of genetic algorithms. And certainly writing for Nature Inspired Informatics, but more importantly doing the chapter reviews for it, reading the kind of cutting edge associated with genetic programming made me realize that perhaps what Bruce is doing is almost a genetic programming experiment rather than genetic algorithms experiment, in terms of throwing just a wide variety of more possibilities into the soup and seeing what emerges. And certainly when I look at Carl Sims' early work and these kind of moving, blocky creatures, which still are fundamentally part of the artificial life community. I mean, this is what, Gerald and Brevet and Framsticks are all moving towards. I think Framsticks has a small genetic programming component, but I've always wondered what would emerge out of a true genetic programming implementation of artificial life. Larry, you have a good surveying of the community. What's your thinking associated with genetic programming?
Well, I think genetic programming is really basically just genetic algorithms applied to trees of Lisp functions. So it's not surprising that it does well. It's a fine environment in which to work. Carl Sims has worked both on the aesthetic selection of those beautiful, beautiful images he created, and the blocky creatures was effectively genetic programming, because he was evolving Lisp functions. And not necessarily just with bit strings. He was doing it on, graph trees. So effectively, he was already doing genetic programming. And it's one very good way to go. One thing I think is interesting about EvoGrid, if I understand this correctly, Bruce, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Bruce doesn't even want to build in genetic programming or genetic algorithms or anything. He wants to put in physics and let evolution go to work, which is an interesting approach. I mean, evolution really is this sort of this tautology, this unavoidable tautology that which survives persists. And if you have the right kind of system capable of sustaining sort of continuous energy flow and continuous variation and some method of reproduction, some method of replication. Let's stay away from reproduction. That brings in other ideas. But replication, just a copying of some sort. The things that copy themselves the best and innovate in obtaining the resources to make more copies are effectively carrying out evolution and genetics, but without having any algorithms built in. And that's sort of a lovely vision, a lovely way to try things.
And I guess my question back to you would be, could entropy be the fundamental selection component? I mean, when I think about EvoGrid-based in genetic programming, it's not traditional, as you say, genetic programming. It is that the physics is part of the selection there. Or if it's not an entropic process, I can't imagine how it would be phrased, but that there are these components in the physics that actually makes the kind of selection that moves towards, be it RNA, be it DNA, be it something that's completely abstract and perhaps analogous or perhaps not analogous at all. I mean, I think that's the beauty of having some form of physics, that you almost get the precursor to what you want to get in traditional genetic algorithms or genetic programming, just in the physics. Do you see that metaphor?
Yes, I do. In fact, if you go back to Schrodinger's "What is Life," 1940-something, he put forward the idea that the defining component of life is basically a localized reduction in entropy, a localized defeating of local and temporal and temporary defeating of the second law of thermodynamics. And he made a point that basically life feeds on negative entropy. And basically negative entropy, the way I like to think of it, is not so much entropy owing, but it's exactly the same thing. But I think of it as information. I mean, positive information is negative entropy. And so think of living things as these little islands of information, that self-sustaining information. And in fact, I mean, you can almost think, I think, in a very real way. It's just a metaphor, but I think information is so fundamental that you can almost think of like the matrix, those lovely images of all the letters floating down on the screen, forming the reality of the matrix virtual reality. You can look at our very real physical reality and see sort of ones and zeros streaming from the sun, coming in and providing not just free energy, but free information, providing information. There's a fellow, what's his name? I'll have to look it up. There's a terrific little book on evolution and information. Avery is his name. That he manages to calculate the number of bits associated with the absorption of a photon at room temperature. So it's like if a photon hits a cell on a plant and it's just turned into heat, that's how many bits effectively are lost at that point. But being a living system, the plant can take that information and use it to extract energy and to do something useful and to sustain itself and sustain this little local island of negative entropy of information. So, yeah, I think entropy is both key to understanding life and key to measuring and determining what's going on in our artificial systems. And ultimately, I think we'll get around to using it to understand what's going on in our physical systems.
Certainly. And moving a step up in terms of what artificial life developers should know when they come to creating artificial life environments, how important do you think kind of broad surveying of artificial intelligence is with regards to creating artificial life systems?
Well, I'm a little biased there. I sort of got into this about the time that people were realizing that symbolic processing and the more traditional good old-fashioned AI, GoFi, was not really panning out, at least not as a path to really general robust intelligence. I mean, it's done great things with expert systems, and there are more examples of products based on GoFi than there are on artificial life, I'm pretty certain, but as an approach to leading to real general artificial intelligence, GoFi wasn't really working out, and so I've eschewed it almost across the board and just stayed away. So,
but I mean, the interesting thing about contemporary artificial intelligence is so much of it wants to be artificial life fundamentally. I mean, this is Eamon Harvey. I mean, these are all these kind of, fundamentally Rodney Brooke as well. I mean, these are all these, artificial life, artificial intelligence researchers. And
yes. Now, whether they use the words artificial life or not, and actually some of them do. I went on an artificial life world tour with Chris Langton and Rodney Brooke, so I know he's well aware of his connections with the community. Whether they currently and routinely use the terms or not, they're definitely doing related work to A-Life.
Certainly. And, I think it's something that, people may need to at least have a precursory sense of in terms of at least the popular connections that people want to make between artificial life and artificial intelligence. So you mentioned briefly predator-prey models, and also, I guess, somewhere through the discussion of physics, sustainable simulation dynamics, these kind of problems. I mean, again, as you started this discussion, you said really it's to do with the kind of simulations you're looking to write, and ultimately these two components are part of that.
Right. Well, I knew that I wanted to at least approach artificial intelligence in a very different way, in a distributed processing way, and being heavily influenced by the early PDP books, parallel distributed processing books, and connectionism and all that. And so I very much needed to start at the sort of neural network level. I didn't want to try to evolve neural networks from fundamental physics. But in fact, I've looked at something that ends up looking a bit like predator-prey models in Polyworld, which is just basically the distribution of agents to food. But it was really a matter of them over-foraging one patch, making the other patch more attractive. And so the agents would start foraging over there, and then they'd over-forage that and make it less attractive. And it kind of had the dynamics of, the sort of food population versus the agent population had this predator-prey, Lotka-Volterra dynamics that ultimately settled into what's called an ideal free distribution, where the agents distributed themselves very nicely according to whatever fraction of the food was in this patch. You'd have exactly that fraction of agents over there, and so on for each of the patches. But these are all that was an outcome of my system. But people look at that from sort of first principles, and I'm not sure exactly what you're after with sustainable simulation dynamics, but that makes me think that again, we have to try to be smart in picking our models so that we can basically coax the maximum information out of those compute cycles that we're using up so rapidly, and be able to run these things and get useful, interesting results in reasonable time periods, and sustain them long enough to get useful, interesting results. I have had people, ask me, well, do you have Polyworld running around the clock all the time? And I thought I should do that, but mostly I've sort of used it for targeted, specific experiments. In fact, most of what I'm doing these days is geared towards looking at the complexity of the neurodynamics in the evolving agents, and hope to get to the point where I can start teasing apart what specific design patterns in the brains of these agents is giving rise to the complexity dynamics, figure out what part of structure is causing all this interesting function. but that's just the current theme.
Certainly, I'm having a lot of fun with it currently with regards to Noble Ape as well, and I think it's something which people can do as they start writing artificial life simulations, or once they have existing artificial life simulation, start looking at running it for long periods of time and what comes out of that. And certainly, in terms of bug tracking and things like that, you do tend to find quite curious extremes over long simulation cycles. But I wanted to also talk with you this evening about the teaching of artificial life, because we've mentioned a number of universities around the world that are either actively teaching artificial life in some sense or using artificial life as part of a kind of graduate research program or an internal research program. Do you get a sense of the number of universities that are teaching artificial life currently, either to undergraduates or graduate students?
Well, you've got me curious. I don't actually know how many people are doing it or anything. I should look around and see what all is going on. I know there are courses out there. A quick Google will turn up a number of different people teaching something, specifically calling it course Artificial Life 2008, Artificial Life, and I can see the course number, and so I know that people are doing this. I'm not sure exactly what they're teaching. It's interesting. A lot of it, there's another person at Indiana University where I am, Luis Rocha, who teaches a course called Bio-Inspired Computing, and I think a number of the courses kind of take that line. What's his name? Gary Flake's book is what the textbook that Luis uses, and so I think people are taking quite different approaches. I designed mine, the course I teach in Artificial Life as an Approach to Artificial Intelligence, specifically to try to give a lot of these fundamental technologies and insights into seeing intelligence as an emergent phenomenon, and what that means and how you can leverage that. And give a general introduction to the field, and bring in some ideas about. I've always said from the earliest days that Polyworld was sort of a way to work our way up the intelligence spectrum. Yes, I want human level intelligence in the machine, but I'm happy to go for computational aplesia before the lab rat, before the simian, and so on. And so I've also done some research into animal cognition, trying to find out a little bit about what we know about the way animals think, what levels of intelligence they're capable of expressing, and some of that's fascinating. So I introduce a little bit of that and talk about Coco the gorilla and dolphins and Betty the crow and Alex the parrot and honeybees that have learned to distinguish abstract concepts of same versus different, and fruit flies that have some kind of salience mechanism that's kind of like an attention mechanism. So anyway, and information theory. Since I claim that information is key to understanding all this, I do a little introduction to information theory as part of the class. So I try to teach some of the very things that we stated at the beginning are the fundamentals: genetic algorithms, neural networks, information theory, evolution, how evolution and learning interact with each other, these sort of different kinds of organisms, both simulated and real, and I get into that Danny Hillis work that I was talking about. And as I said, start it and stop it with Chris Langton's stuff. So,
and I mean, a question that I wanted to ask you when you were last on, particularly with regards to stopping and starting with Chris Langton, although you have mentioned more contemporary theorists, is, I mean, certainly through discussion in Biota Live and with the participants, there is a strong contemporary sense that artificial life has a good impact in companies like Apple and Intel in my own experience, and certainly looking at Rodney Brooks' work, I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of the applications there. You're getting a very broad range of students coming through that may go on to, to be Nigel Griffith in academia, or may go on to actually work for one of these companies, or go out into, in terms of bioinformatics, I mean, folks like Ed, and we've had a few other listeners who've corresponded with me that do exactly what Ed does at other biochemistry companies. So, I mean, I think the diversity of uses for contemporary artificial life are really, the imagination is really the limit in terms of these uses. If you were...
Fundamental skills that I'm teaching in this class, I think, are of help no matter what they do with it, whether they go into true artificial life as their primary research direction, or they go off into industry, or they take another tack in academia. The nicest compliment any former student has ever given me was a student from my A-Life class who got accepted to MIT and emailed me a few months into the semester saying, of all the courses I took at university, yours is the one has been the most help here at MIT. And I thought, wow, that's pretty much as nice a thing as a teacher can hope to hear.
I think this is the theme through what we're trying to do with things like Biota Live as well, that the nature of what we're discussing may appear trivial precursorily to folks, tuning in on an occasional basis. But for the practitioners and the people as you have, who have devoted large portions of their life to the discipline, it needs to move probably in the next, 5 to 10 years into something which may actually exist on its own as a discipline. Do you see this happening with regards to your teaching of artificial life? Do you see it becoming something that would be a standalone discipline within perhaps the School of Informatics, perhaps the School of Computer Science? Is this your long-term view?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, it already is. I mean, you will find, there's a fairly strong A-Life community in the academic community. I think I may have even mentioned A-Life 11 was in Europe for the first time for this particular conference, and last summer. And the level of work, the quality of work going on in Europe was actually astounding and delightfully so. And there's some brilliant work going on over here. Sometimes it shows up under the guise of robotics. And I know, we have a fairly strong statement right in everything we talk about in our complex systems group in the School of Informatics where I am. We almost always mention artificial life right up front. We consider it part of our charter, part of our group's theme. So to a certain extent, it's already here. Now, it's not a huge community, but there is artificial life and European Conference on Artificial Life and simulation of adaptive behavior, and IEEE now has an artificial life symposium as part of a general computational intelligence conference. There's actually quite a bit of work and interest in the area, probably about as much as the field can sustain right now.
I guess this is my point, really, that in order to move the field further forward, particularly with regards to the idea of, potentially Bachelor of Science in Artificial Life, there are already MSc in Artificial Life programs, but moving it perhaps a little, lower into a bachelor program with regards to particularly the applications in industry. I think this is what's going to be interesting in the next few years, and you really are in the perfect position to motivate this kind of discussion and also have this kind of thinking. Certainly watching it as an observer, the need for things like textbooks, the need for things like unified curriculum, some kind of discussion associated with what this thing is moving towards, similar to what occurs, as you're well aware, in physics and possibly also in biology and mathematics and these kind of areas. I mean, I think this is what will be the interesting transition in the next 5 to 10 years, and I'm certainly interested in having you on a kind of semi-regular basis to instigate this kind of discussion in your own thinking. In terms of what I'm saying, I mean, does that gel with what you're thinking, and can you talk a little bit about that potential in the future?
Well, honestly, now I have really not sure what I think about where the future is going with this stuff, because I don't currently see artificial life as being quite that sort of formalized. I mean, by the time you get to teaching a calculus class, calculus has been taught for so many years now. The field has been around for so long, and then it's also been taught in universities for so long that it's kind of prescription. It's you always teach this, you always teach it in this order. That they can hire lecturers in. They don't even have to have the faculty do it, because the course is extremely well designed, and they know exactly what they want the outcomes to be. Artificial life, at least for a while, is going to need to remain fluid, and I hope it still is sufficiently innovative and sufficiently a moving target that there's not going to be a one true artificial life syllabus created that is going to be the way to teach artificial life. For what it's worth, you should also realize that university faculty they've worked hard to get where they are, and there's this thing called academic freedom, and it is invoked to mean I get to teach what I darn well want to teach, as long as the core courses are covered. And so there's a lot of, I mean, it's a good thing. I mean, that there's so much academic freedom that I can design a course that teaches artificial life in a way that I think is important. But Luis Rocha can design a course that's really getting around the same ideas, and yet it's an entirely different course. With his bio-inspired computing, and yet both of them are very much sort of, in the A-life realm. So I think it's a little too early to be trying to codify the artificial life curriculum.
So a top-down example in this is the idea of Java teaching the programming language Java. And this is certainly something that I experienced in 95 when I started university. I didn't take computer science, but I certainly spent a lot of time in the university leading up to actually going to university. And my experience with regards to what happened with Java was that all the computer science courses associated with C, C++, all the stuff that led towards that was removed and replaced with Java almost instantaneously. And I'm trying to think, I mean, outside of areas that I know, it's very difficult for me to think about certain aspects of law, and I'm sure in engineering there are examples. But I think it's, in some regard, a little, I wouldn't want to say naive, but certainly the length of time that these things have been going on should, if anything, really distill it in more solidity rather than still make it as something which is vague, particularly if I look at how fast computer science courses change associated with fashion, and I'm sure .NET was rolled out just as quickly as Java was. But what you say with regards to artificial life being fundamentally fluid and organic currently, I think is very true. But as you note, there are so many courses that seem to be cropping up that are teaching artificial life, and certainly the feedback I get from doing Biota Live is that a number of these students listen into Biota Live almost like a tutorial in some regard, is that this is being informally organized in a way where it's almost screaming out for a certain layer of formality to cover that. So, I mean, I guess that's just my point with regards to this, that as a passive and somewhat distant observer, through the correspondence that I've had with students and also folks such as yourself, Larry, in talking about things like A-Life 11, my sense is that there is almost a need for not necessarily, as you say, strict dictated calculus courses coming in, but at least some acknowledgement that this is an intellectual movement that, merits some degree of surveying and not necessarily explicit formality, but at least some general agreement the world over that this is what artificial life means. These are the components that lead into it. If people want to come to a conversation, and this we find through the Biota Conversations mailing list continuously, that because there is still no set, you need to know a little bit about this, a little bit about that, but at least this kind of smorgasbord of ideas, there will people that come in still who don't have a background necessarily in half a dozen of the areas that we've discussed, but are very strong in, Dawkins' genetic algorithms from, ironically, The Blind Watchmaker or related books associated with that. My interest in bringing you on regularly, and also I'll talk to Mark Verdot about this as well, is that as a passive observer, I see the need for this, particularly in industry as well. I think if there was even a slightly more level of formalization associated with the teaching of artificial life, these concepts and ideas could easily be kind of brought together in something that actually was recognized formally by industry in a way that is currently kind of informally being recognized. Bruce, as you listen into this, what's your thinking about this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's the field. I agree with Larry. The field is very, very fluid, and definitions are shifting, and we're seeing artificial life applied to synthetic biology and chemistry now. I guess with what Mark Verdot will point out next week. Is it next week he's coming on?
No, Zan Gill will be on the next show in 2 weeks, and Mark will be on in a month's time.
A month's time. I mean, he talks about artificial life starting in the digital realm and then moving into robotics and chemistry. Its center seems to be spreading out and moving. So I think it's the field's actually getting bigger, and that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, it's definitely not just one thing.
Yeah, and my goal of the EvoGrid project, and you'll see it in EvoGrid the movie, is, I know I keep plugging the movie, but it shows a very cartoony way of going from a digital simulation to a nano-fabbed chemical entity for the public to understand this.
So I think this probably concludes the discussion this evening, and maybe even frames the discussion with Mark as well with regards to this topic. But I mean, in terms of what we've been discussing, Larry, does this gel with you at all in terms of just something that you'll take away and think about?
Yes, and also if there are some undergraduates listening to this who think they might want to pursue a PhD and with a predominantly artificial life slant, I'm at Indiana University.
Certainly. And I think, Virgil as an example, I mean, I think the potential even for undergraduates who are in the US and looking for, or even high school, looking to go to college, which colleges they would like to go to. Can you give some introduction to Virgil's experience and how he came into artificial life as an undergraduate?
And Virgil's not your normal case. I knew that as soon as I met him. He actually had been going to a different university, Alabama, I think. Don't hold me to that. And had come up, I think he had thought to work with Douglas Hofstadter, and he was just sort of bouncing around and talking to different people, and he landed in my office a few times, and we got to talking more and more, and we found that we had such strong shared interests that we ended up working together for a couple of years, and then he finally finished up his degree. I think he actually got his degree back from his original university just because he had enough credits, and with the ones he was able to import from IU, he finally finished up his bachelor's and headed off to Caltech for their computational neuroscience studies there. So he really was just actively pursuing what interested him the most, and this was it, and so we got on really well.
So the moral initially is find sympathetic academics and take it from there if you're currently an undergraduate student looking to pursue artificial life in the future.
Absolutely. You need to find a place where the things that interest you interest the faculty.
Certainly. Larry, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you this evening. And Bruce, I guess you'll be on in 2 weeks' time with Zan Gill.
I guess so.
I'm really interested to hear what Zan has to say with regards to the environmental stuff. Thank you both very much for participating in this evening's Biota Live, and thanks, folks, for listening in.
Good night.